Hi, Roger Griffiths here at the Hub. Welcome to this day 25 of our election coverage. That's the federal election for 2025. We've got Sean Speer joining me, co-founder and editor at large, and a bunch of great guests on the show for you in the next half hour. Just urge everyone to pile into the chat if you've got questions. We're going to make sure that we have time at the end of the program to get to those. Sean, I want to begin with you just for your quick reaction to last night's French language debate and the growing controversy this morning about a press conference that unfolded after the debate.
Yeah, as people watching the show probably know or may know, there's been a big reaction, particularly from those in the mainstream media who have reacted negatively to the participation of a number of independent news voices in last night's post-debate media veil. Groups like Juno News and Rebel News had journalists there who put questions to the leaders of varying quality. Some of them I thought were quite interesting and important, others perhaps less so. But the big reaction to the post debate scrum, in a way that dwarfs the debate itself, Roger, it strikes me as rather telling.
Yeah, we had our reporter there, Ellie, got a question into Blanchard, the Quebec leader, which is great. I will say it was a little bit strange for the Debates Commission, another own goal after disinviting the Green Party yesterday on very kind of dubious interpretation of its own rules. It seems, Sean, that they allowed True North 5 reporters at the event, seemingly to avoid the threat of additional litigation that True North had previously launched against the commission. And it led to, again, a kind of ridiculous situation where not just the Hub, but other news outlets are kind of standing in line with a disproportionate number of Rebel News people. So, I mean, great for Rebel News, a fantastic moment for gonzo journalism that Ezra, their founder, is so good at. But again, I feel for this commission. It just seems to be, tripping over its own feet whenever it has a chance.
Yeah, snatching defeat from the jaws of victory seems to be its modus operandi. I agree, but it does speak to a much bigger issue, doesn't it, Roger? I mean, there are various reasons why we've had misgivings about the Trudeau government's regime of public subsidies for journalism. A big one that we don't often talk a lot about, but shouldn't be neglected, is that it puts the government in the position of making judgments of who is or who is not a journalist. And that really is at the heart of what played out last night. The litigation that led to True North and Rebel being part of last night's post-election scrums stems from their exclusion in last election's debate by the Debate Commission, something that they successfully litigated and opened the door to them participating today. One can agree or disagree about their approach. One can agree or disagree even with the questions that they put to them yesterday. But it does speak to the inherent problem of leaving politicians and bureaucrats making judgments about who indeed is a journalist.
Yeah, great point. You know, if we just simply go back to what we've been doing for decades, which is having private groups, primarily broadcasters, organizing these debates, it's in some ways easier for non-government groups to say, hey, look, here's the rules. You don't like them? Well, sorry, we're a private organization. Government obviously has to be accountable. Sometimes that's good, but in other times you don't really want, when it comes to something as bizarre as government organizing leaders debates of 1,001 problems facing the country, this surely was 1,002. But let's go to the ground in Quebec right now to get some reaction, Sean, to last night's debate. Pleasure to welcome onto the program JP Fournier, who's with the Tenio Group, where he's a vice president, watching the debate closely as a francophone. JP, your top line analysis of what you saw last night. Any clear winners to you? Any clear losers that stood out from what was a pretty exhausting, grueling 2-hour contest?
Yeah, no, it was it had its moments, to be frank, but it was maybe not a debate that I would say drew that much of a reaction post debate, or not, at least not as much as some of its leaders would have hoped it would, right? Carney, since becoming leader, has been ahead about 20% in the polls in Quebec, even with a, I would say, barely passing grade level of French. And both Blanchet, both Poilievre, and to some extent Jagmeet Singh, they both wanted this opportunity to shine through. Now, unfortunately for the opposition, there was no KO. But in a sense, every leader achieved at least some of their objectives. So Mark Carney had no big mistake. His French was okay. Sometimes it was difficult to understand, but you know, there was no huge disaster. Poilievre looked like a prime minister, which I know he was trying to do, and he succeeded at that. He got some good attacks, especially with law and order on the law and order subject. Um, so I think he could should be satisfied with his debate. Now, there was no knockout punch, so we'll see what happens in terms of polling. And then Jagmeet Singh had this very bizarre exchange with the moderator where he went off about there not being any questions on healthcare and this being a super important subject. And that I think that probably hurt him much more than helped him at the end of the day. And then Blanchet, obviously the most at ease in the French language. Overall, okay debate, but again, nothing that, at least for now, we would expect massive to generate massive movement. And again, you could also argue that most of the movement comes from the post-debate debate rather than the debate itself. So that's to be seen.
JP, there's so many things to talk to you about. You mentioned Mark Carney's strong support in Quebec in spite of his limited French proficiency, the ceiling on the bloc support in a world in which I think a lot of people anticipated that they were going to be highly competitive in this election. There was the debate about pipelines, and I'd be curious to get your reaction on what you think Quebecers think about it. But let's start with Carney, because I think one of the things that English Canadians have found surprising is that we've been conditioned to believe that bilingualism is a kind of fundamental principle or a fundamental requirement for those aspiring to be the prime minister, that Quebecers will simply not support someone who doesn't meet a high standard when it comes to bilingualism. Given Mark Carney's limitations, what do you think explains his strong support in the province of Quebec?
I think the one way you could, perfectly capture this, there was someone doing a vox pop, right? So a journalist going onto the street asking people what they thought. And one journalist asked someone, some random person in the street, what do you think about Carney's French? And his answer was, do you need to speak French to answer Donald Trump?
Hmm.
And I think that pretty much captures whether you agree with it or not, it captures, I think, the feeling for a lot of Quebecers. I know, at least in my lifetime, and quite frankly, and for many decades, we've never seen this before. Your capacity to speak French and your capacity to communicate in not just in a passing way, but in a comfortable way. Where you're able to make jokes, make cultural references, things like that, was crucial to you getting support in Quebec.
Yes.
And historically, Anglophone leaders for the Liberal Party have done catastrophically bad in the province, and he seems to be bucking that trend. But I think that's because of something more profound that's happened. This election, to the surprise of many, obviously the polling has changed dramatically in the last 3 months, and it's because it's happening in a very peculiar geopolitical moment, and it turns out that Quebecers are attuned to that. Now, you could argue that it's not the best idea to make a decision of the next 4 years in the direction of your country for something that's maybe more temporary than you might expect, right? Trump will not be here forever, whereas your vote today and the decision of your government will have an impact for many years. But that's where we find ourselves. So some people have a hard time explaining it to themselves because it's brand new, but when you talk to people here on the ground, it's pretty ubiquitous.
Mm-hmm. Jean-Philippe, talk to us a little bit about just where the electorate is at in Quebec as we go into the final 10 days of this campaign. We've seen, surprising strength on the part of the Liberals, and that strength has come really from a pretty substantial underperformance of the Bloc. This seems confusing to a lot of us here in English-speaking Canada because we've heard over the last year or so that there was a renewed Parti Québécois that potentially would be vying for government in the next provincial election. So if there is a kind of, growing kind of separatist sentiment in Quebec, or even just simply nationalist sentiment, why isn't that translating to the Bloc? And why are, the Liberals just so far ahead kind of historically in the context of recent federal elections?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think one of the people that are the most surprised by the change in polling was probably Yves-François Blanchet himself. But when you look at the rise of the PQ provincially, which started about in the fall of 23, after a by-election there, that really launched them to become like the principal opposition to the government and the viable the government in waiting. Their support did not coincide with a rise actually in the support for separation. And when you look at the number of people that wanted or were telling pollsters that they were going to vote for the PQ, about a third said we're Federalists, or at least would have voted no in a referendum if there was a referendum question asked to them at that time. So the rise of the PQ did not coincide with the rise in separatist sentiment. It was more tied to a unpopularity or a loss of popularity with the provincial government. And it's difficult to transpose that to the federal scene. So the Bloc was riding high because the Bloc serves as a none of the above option usually for Quebecers, right? They can't form government. You kind of park your vote there kind of as I don't like the Conservatives, I don't like the Liberals. Yeah, let's just vote for these guys. They'll stay in opposition. It doesn't matter. And Trudeau was deeply unpopular. And the Conservatives were starting to rise. And they were doing some of their best polling probably in history, or at least since 2015 for sure, hitting the high 20s, even some polls putting them in the 30s, low 30s. This would have hugely redrawn the map. But then Carney arrived, and it seems that in the context of Trump and in the context of, we need to lock arms and defend our country in front of this man down at the south of the border who's threatening our sovereignty. Well, we're going to go with the party that, at least in the eyes of Quebecers, the general population of Quebecers, better encapsulates Canada or represents Canada, and that's for them the Liberal Party. And I think that there's also an argument to make that Carney was able to spin, or at least his team was able to spin his CV around him in such a way that really drove that kind of confidence in his capacity to deal with Donald Trump. But that's that's my sense of what happened. And the Bloc has just been completely absent in the political discourse since late January. I'm hearing anecdotes left, right, and center about seats that were once thought safe by the Bloc, where the sitting MP is panicking, and where the central war room, if you want, are saying, yeah, that's great. We're actually going to take your volunteers and move them to another apparently safer riding that's also in danger. So it's really, really sorry for you, but we're going to try to save to save the rest of the burning house here. So it's really not going very well for them. And again, I'm just going to bring everyone's attention to the polling. Carney is doing around 42, 43%. The Bloc's at 22, 23, 24. In 2011, when they got 4 seats, they did 23.4.
Wow.
So it's not going to be as dramatic because the Liberals aren't as strong with the Francophone vote, right? They're very concentrated in Montreal and the Anglophones. But we're looking at overall support for the bloc that's some of its lowest ever. And you know, if trends continue, they're gonna have really one heck of a hangover on the 29th of April.
Wow.
Talking about hangovers, I want to ask about something that has gone mostly unreported, at least in English Canada, and that is last week's meeting between Premier Legault and Alberta Premier Daniel Smith. We have a lot of Western Canadians who watch the show. JP, why don't you talk a bit about the significance of this meeting and what it might mean for what on the face of it appears an unconventional Alberta-Quebec alliance in the event that Mark Carney and the Liberals are reelected?
Yeah. So just real quick on the Alberta-Quebec relationship, I always say that Albertans and Quebecers are actually probably the two provinces, and not just the provinces, but the people who are the most similar and they're most alike or at least more alike than people like to think in the country. Both provinces and people who have, I believe, at least in both cases, a distinct culture, have their own identity. They strongly identify with their province, and they also believe that, the federal government, that's great, but let's just try to keep them out as much as possible and let us run our own stuff. And that fundamental alignment was understood to some extent by the current government, the current CAQ government, as early as 2018. In 2019, so 1 year after the election, I traveled with my former boss, then Minister of Finance, Éric Girard, and we toured all the Western provinces, met with then Premier Jason Kenney, met with also their finance ministers in Alberta, BC, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And the goal there was to try to build closer ties. COVID happened, things happened. I don't think the result was as what we expected it to be, but that this is back on the radar today makes perfect sense, and makes all the more sense in a case where the current person who could be prime minister in 12 days, indirectly or directly attacks the interests of both these provinces, whether it's natural resources for Alberta, or whether it's laïcité, or even though he doesn't say it, in some cases the French language or defending the French language in Quebec, but more laïcité, and even immigration. So that I think that there is a awareness both from Daniel Smith and from François Legault that there is a fundamental alignment. Forget the whole energies debate that poisoned the well for a few years. If you remove that, or at least even better, if you fix it, well, there's no two provinces that should be more on side and more allied than Quebec and Alberta. And I think that that's being shown through with this meeting. I'm not sure what came of it. I've heard some positive things. I know that there are more meetings ongoing over the next few days as well, not necessarily between Premier and Premier, but between staff and between people a little bit less higher up. And we can expect that that alignment could continue and maybe even grow, especially if there's a Carney government. And we've seen the beginning of that already on subjects that, quite frankly, even 6 months ago, we never thought would have happened, right? Where the other provinces said they would support Quebec on the Bill 21, on the laïcité bill challenge, and openness from Quebec on a pipeline, which quite is surprising, and it's great news for national unity and great news for Alberta, but also great news for Canada. But movement on that, on arguably the two most important subjects for both those provinces, I think we could expect some pretty interesting things to come from that relationship.
Yeah. Well, thank you, JP. So great to get your on-the-ground reaction to last night's debate and a kind of temperature test on the politics and policy shaping the Quebec electorate. So JP Fournier from Tenio, formerly with Quebec's Minister of Finance as a senior policy advisor. Let's do this again soon.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, Sean, a real pleasure now to welcome onto the program someone who plays a senior role at CIBC Capital Markets, but more importantly has a storied political past of involvement and engagement in federal politics at the highest level as a cabinet minister, and obviously as someone that has shaped the public conversation on a bunch of important issues. So pleasure to welcome onto the program Lisa Raitt.
Thank you very much. Great to be here. When you say storied background, it gets me a little nervous, I got to admit.
You're
I don't know which way this is going to
go. Just your quick reactions to last night, the debate commission, this whole thing. We seem to go round and around 3 elections now with this commission, and with kind of, I don't know, Lisa, I thought last night's debate was kind of middling. It was more like a job interview than an actually what I would consider a proper debate.
They certainly weren't challenged, were they? In terms of the moderator, I think the moderator was a facilitator. I thought he directed traffic just fine. I mean, I'm coming at it from a conservative bias, but sometimes when Mr. Carney would answer, the moderator would reflexively say "très bien," meaning, okay, good, you've got through that question. Let's move on to the next question. So I thought that was a positive affirmation for Mr. And it didn't happen just once. It happened a couple of times, as I noted. Gosh, in a French debate, I'd love anyone saying to me "très bien" after one of my answers in French, to be honest. So I thought that that was okay. It was watchable. No big punches landed, as has been commented upon many, many times. But, one thing that I did find interesting is the fact that at the end of the time, they showed who had spoken the most. And I swear, I thought Jagmeet Singh spoke more than anybody else did. But I guess it's just because whenever he was speaking, I'd be shaking my head and being in disagreement with whatever he was saying. It felt longer than it actually was. But, watchable. I may have nodded off in the middle of it. Tonight will be interesting, but I suppose tonight they're going to have to come out with fire. They need better clips, quite frankly, for their socials than they got last night.
Yeah, good point.
Lisa, I think one thing that we can anticipate carrying over from last night's debate and into tonight's debate is Mark Carney's essential line that I just got here and I just arrived, when Pierre Poilievre tried to make the case that although the Liberal Party has a new leader, this, as the Poilievre campaign has put it, essentially a 4th term for the Liberals. Talk a bit about Carney's positioning on that issue and what the Conservatives need to do to make the case that, irrespective of what Canadians think about Mark Carney, this remains at its core the same government that people disliked 3 months ago.
I don't know if I would have advised him to use that line or take that tack, to be honest. Everybody's responsible in the country for where we are right now, even if you weren't part of the government making the decisions. We're all in this together. But to distance yourself by saying, oh, well, I wasn't here at that point in time. Of course you were. You were giving advice. It's easily proven that you were part of this team. You chaired Canada 2020, which is the think tank that feeds into the policy of the Liberal Party of Canada. I mean, you are part of it. You were proudly part of it. You did roundtables across the country for this party. So why would he come out and say that unless he possibly believes that Canadians are going to buy it? I really hope that we do a better job as Conservatives of disabusing the notion that he hasn't been part of this and hasn't been a supreme advisor in all of this, quite frankly. And can I say one last thing?
Please.
He should know better. He should know better than to say something like that. You take responsibility for your actions in this world, even if you are a politician. And that line could be spun into some really deadly oppo ads if it's played correctly.
Yeah.
And Lisa, what's your feeling as to why Mark Carney seems to be getting such a pass in this election? And look, I just think that's an objective fact. If you look at the media coverage, there's been, for instance, very little reporting, if any, on his and his wife, and that's fine. We've got wives that work, we've got spouses that work, that's terrific, but they're at an entity called the Eurasia Group that happens to have somebody called Jerry Butts working there, that happened to have somebody called Evan Solomon, who's now a candidate for the Liberals. There's all these like stories and threads that connect, as you say, Mark Carney back to the Trudeau Liberals, and embed him and his family and others around him, that's fine. He's a liberal. Good on him. He's running for the liberal. Ran for the liberal leadership and running now to be a liberal prime minister. That's all out in the open. But I'm just curious as to why you think that these backstories haven't been a bigger part of this campaign.
I think that the campaign time is too short. I think that he came in with such a whirlwind of action, meaning that Trudeau's gone on January 6th. He's announcing that he's running. There's a leadership. There's all kinds of stuff going on, and then Trump. So in amongst all of that, people are just kind of, I believe, looking at the top line analysis, and the top line analysis is his resume, and it's his work resume that people are interested in, not entirely who the individual is. The other candidates up there on the stage, we've known them for many, many, many years. So it's beyond knowing what they've done. It's knowing who they are. This candidate isn't running on who he is at his core. He's telling us who he is, but we really don't know who he is. And I'm not saying that in a nefarious way. Don't take it like that.
Yep.
But he hasn't been tested. He hasn't had microphones shoved in his face as he's walking to and from the House of Commons. He hasn't been put, I would say, in any kind of situations that are such that you're going to have a reaction that you haven't carefully planned or curated. And as such, if he walks in as prime minister, there may be a very large buyer's remorse by the Canadian public pretty quickly after he gets there, just given what I've seen so far and how he politics. I can't imagine he's going to want to do a lot of interviews or do a lot of one-on-ones or transparency or communication. I think he's just going to go back into his office
something there that
and read
intrigued me.
papers.
How he politics. I mean, you got a lot of experience politicking. You're pretty successful at it. What are you seeing in his politicking that worries you as someone who has put in the 10,000 hours, so to speak?
Yeah. I think the most successful politicians are the ones who aren't afraid to be their authentic self, for good or for bad. If you're putting out a front, people can sniff it out very quickly. And if I've had success in my life, it's because people got to know me as a person, and you can't hide from that. I am who I am. And I look at a guy like John Baird as well. I mean, John Baird is his authentic self. You know exactly who you're getting. And that's why I think he's a successful politician as well. I don't know if Mark knows who he is as a politician. I certainly don't think he's a Main Street politician. I think he's a Bay Street politician, quite frankly. Church dinners and facing your people in different parts of the country, that's a very different skill set than sitting at the top of a board table as the chair.
I want to stay on this theme because another thing that he hasn't done is manage a broad and diverse caucus. One thing that someone said to me last week that has really resonated is if you look at the NDP support today relative to its historic norm, the Liberals have absorbed something like 50% of the NDP within their coalition. So you have, as you say, Lisa, those on the right edge of the Carney coalition who are capitalists and we might characterize as business liberals, to, on the other end, Hamas supporting social activists. And one gets a sense that Mr. Carney is struggling to strike that balance. You've seen him say different things on pipelines. You've seen him say different things on Israel-Hamas. Just talk a bit about the inherent challenge of managing a coalition, particularly in the face of big issues like a Canada-U.S. negotiation, a possible recession, national unity, etc., in a world in which you're operating with a pretty diverse group of characters and interests.
And that's the magic in being a good leader and being a good prime minister, is that you have to recognize you've got a variety of stakeholders in his career. And it's been a phenomenal career that Mark Carney has had. But let's look back since 2000 and forgive me, I don't remember when he became the governor of the Bank of Canada, but let's say for maybe 2007, 2008, because he was there in 2009. So since that time, he has been in command and control positions. He hasn't been in a position where he's actually had to negotiate with stakeholders, even listen to stakeholders. He may have given advice to the government, but within his own domain, he was the master, right? I mean, it's not an accident that he says he's the master. We're the masters of our own. So Bank of Canada, he definitely was in charge. In the Bank of England, I don't know if a lot of people know this, but I was reminded by somebody that I work with. They still wear waistcoats as they bring tea and coffee to the head of the governor of the Bank of England. It is very formal. It is very layered in hereditary kinds of moves and shakers and it's if you've worked in England, it's still there, right? That kind of hierarchy is still there. That kind of Lord of the Manor is still there. And as such, he would not have been bothered by troublesome issues such as working with stakeholders. And then, of course, in his very great success in private sector, walking into chairships of Bloomberg, of Brookfield, of G7 kind of things. Again, command and control positions, not really listening to the person who is working at Stellantis who's going to lose their job. And that's an important piece of being a leader. You got to feel the pain of the constituent in order to make the right decision. And I don't know if he's wired to do that.
Draw on another part of your specific experience, Lisa, sitting around a cabinet table. How do you think it works if Mark Carney becomes prime minister and you have someone, as you say, that comes out of the heady heights of international finance, of central banking, and arrives in that cabinet? What do you think those dynamics are like? Because again, I think you and others are onto something here. It's very different to be inside a bureaucracy, which is what a central bank is, or leading a $1 trillion asset manager like Brookfield as chair. You are in an organization, you put it aptly, in a command and control type situation. And I'm sure you can fill us in on this. I'm sure there's command and control elements in cabinet. After all, there is the first minister and the prime minister. But those other dynamics that make cabinets and make governments work, what do you see as the challenges here in a Carney-led government?
Well, first and foremost, if you're coming from the investment banking world, it is a pyramid. And at the top, you're supported by all the employees below you who are working around the clock, oftentimes young, churning out information, data, decks, all that kind of stuff. And they are professional. They are good at what they do. They're top of their game. So the information that somebody in command and control would receive is quick, it's fulsome, it's professional, and it's exactly what you would want to get. You're not going to get that in the government, folks. That's not going to happen. I can imagine his frustration will be immense in terms of trying to figure out where are the first year associates who are going to provide me with all the information and stay up all night till 2 a.m. to churn out the spreadsheets. It ain't going to happen. And I think that will be a big disconnect for him. I mean, maybe he doesn't remember what it was like in the Bank of Canada, and maybe it wasn't like that in the Bank of Canada, but I can assure you, when he understands that to implement possibly one of his policies, whatever that may be, because we haven't really gotten deep on his policies, that in order to change a big piece of legislation, it's going to take 17 to 25 meetings plus regulatory approvals plus Treasury Board. I'm sure that when he sees it takes 18 to 24 months to do something like that, because he has to go through a process, he may wonder, what am I doing here? How can the frustration will be real, and how he deals with that frustration will be what makes or breaks him as a prime minister, quite frankly.
May I just say, just to Lisa's just tremendous insight. I don't know if I've ever shared this before, but during the global financial crisis, Roger and Lisa, Prime Minister Harper not often, quarterly, every couple of months, would ask then Governor Carney to come to PMO to provide a briefing, because it was the Prime Minister's view that the Bank of Canada's analysis was generally stronger than the Department of Finance's, for what it's worth. So, as you say, getting into the system, managing a caucus, managing a cabinet, managing external stakeholders, these are all part and parcel of a successful prime ministership. As we wrap up, Lisa, if we could just look ahead to tonight's debate, I know that a lot of our listeners and viewers will be watching it closely. What should they be looking for to make a judgment about its importance or consequences for this election?
I think you have to look, man, I was on the doors this weekend, and I've been having a lot of like mini roundtables in terms of talking to clients and friends, quite frankly. And I think we've transitioned from the point of view where we just want to have the right person with the right resume to talk to Donald Trump. I think we're coming out of that. And now people are thinking, I want to know what you want to do for the country and for the economy, quite frankly. Other of my friends, they say, I want to know what you're doing for the environment. So I think there's going to be an environment part of tonight that the Conservatives better have a good response for, quite frankly. And I think they're going to be, they have to come out with an idea. People are going to talk about concrete plans over the weekend because as families gather, not everybody at that table is going to have a house. Not everybody at that table is going to have a great job that they have, or a pension that they're able to live on. So there's going to have to be some real decision making as to what you're looking for in the future. But you're not going to ask me who I think is going to win, but I'm going to say this anyway because it's kind of what I'm saying to clients as I talk to them. I still believe that the Conservatives are going to win, but I also believe that the Toronto Maple Leafs are going to win the Stanley Cup this year too. So I'm an optimist. What can I say?
Hey, they're in the playoffs, so
exactly.
Something good is happening. There's some mojo going on. Lisa Raitt, thank you so much for coming on the program.
Pleasure.
Let's do this again before the campaign wraps up.
I'd be happy to. Thanks, gentlemen.
Thanks. Awesome. Lisa Raitt, a former senior cabinet minister in federal government and also managing director, vice chair, CIBC World Markets. Well, Sean, a great show. Once again, getting out to the regions a little bit to test the temperature out there. Hopefully that was helpful to our listeners and viewers, and then to kind of go into the belly of the beast to someone who's been really at the pinnacle of the federal government in terms of governance and cabinet and caucus, to get Lisa's take on some of the challenges that either Mark Carney or, frankly, Pierre Poilievre is going to face in that role. It's very, very different than what either one of these men has ever done in their lives.
Yeah. And that ultimately is the judgment we're making here, right? Who is going to be the best prime minister for the next 4 years? A period in which, Rudyard, we're going to be navigating some pretty significant files. This is not Justin Trudeau assuming office in 2015 in a moment of relative peace and prosperity, or even Stephen Harper in 2006, who inherits a good balance sheet, a relatively stable economy, a relatively peaceful geopolitical environment. This is a big task at hand, and while people are drawn to Carney's background and credentials, as Lisa says, there's an open question about his politicking, as she put it. I like that. Pierre Poilievre, by contrast, what everyone thinks about him, I've often said, Rudyard, would be the most experienced Conservative prime minister since Sir John A. Macdonald, in the sense that he has oversaw the largest department in the Government of Canada, the Department of Human Resources Development. He's been a member of the Prime Minister's Cabinet Committee. He's served in caucus, in Parliament, and Cabinet for several years. This is someone who, whatever you think about his politics or his ideas, does know the system, does know how to make it work. And one wonders if that's something he leans into as part of his sales pitch down the final days of this campaign.
Yeah, a closing argument. We will see. Thank you again, Sean, and thank you to all the listeners and viewers watching or hearing this show on demand, either on the Hub's podcast feed or YouTube channel. So we're going to say goodbye to you now, and in a moment say hello to all those good folk on the live stream. So if you are listening and watching on demand, you want to be part of the live show. We broadcast Monday to Friday at 10 a.m. Eastern, and you can get into the chat too and get questions to Sean and me and be part of the discussion. So here's that bye-bye.